You ever think about the trolley problem so much that it became an integral part of your personality? Me neither, but these idiots sure did. Today we're talking about heroes. Across almost every medium, books, anime, movies, video games, heroism is one of the most common traits possessed by the protagonist. Whether they start that way, become a hero along the way, or are forced into being one by outside interference, the main character almost always ends up being a hero of some kind, running into unfavourable situations against impossible odds to save their nakama or the world or whatever. It's not hard to figure out why. If you need an idiot to repeatedly try and get themselves killed in spectacular fashion, you don't get any better than a hero. Just throw one of their friends in danger and the dramatic plot basically writes itself. I mean, why come up with a logical reason for Ichigo to storm the afterlife armed with only an oversized kitchen knife and a carrot top to save a girl he basically just met? He's Ichigo. Of course he wouldn't blink at fighting an entire army and their pet phoenix. He wouldn't be Ichigo if he even hesitated. For most characters, that's all heroism is though. Another adjective to add to their character sheet. Naruto is blonde, hyperactive, fond of orange, and also a hero. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for some characters, heroic is more than an adjective. For these characters, being a hero forms the basis of their character. Their ideals, goals, and entire narrative arc centre around the concept of saving others and doing good. Midoriya Izuku from My Hero Academia and Shirou Emiya from Fate are both defined by their heroism, and they have some interesting parallels between them. But more than that, they serve as an example of how heroism can make a character either deeply interesting or, unfortunately, rather bland. Now, before the My Hero fandom assassinates me, this isn't just going to be another hit piece on Deku. There are things I like and dislike about his character, but more an examination of his core ideals and how they compare to Shirou's. I'll look at the why, the how, and then the what of their heroics. That last one probably seems like it should go first, but trust me, it should hopefully make sense when we get there. First though, a quick summary of each character in case you aren't familiar with them. Izuku Midoriya, or Deku, is a boy born without superpowers in a world in which 80% of people possess them. Despite this, he aspires to be a hero. Not like an abstractly defined hero, like a proper professional with a uniform and everything. He's told he can't all his life, then tries to use the power of books to beat a villain and is rewarded with his very own superpower that may or may not blow up his limbs every so often. The story follows him as he tries to emulate the #1 hero and become the next symbol of peace. Shirou Emiya comes from Fate's Stay Night, and if you know anything about Fate, that means that explaining the lore surrounding his background would take about 3 hours and several shots of vodka, so here are the basics. There's a war where heroes from mythology fight for the Holy Grail. One of these wars results in Shirou's hometown being burned to cinders, with Shirou barely surviving and basically having all his memories burnt out, leaving him a shell of a human. He also got a roided up version of survivor's guilt, which, combined with his dying father's wish, results in him striving to become a hero that saves everyone, with no concern for himself. Fans of either series are probably angry at how brief those descriptions were, but hopefully if you clicked on this video you're at least somewhat familiar with the characters, and if not, well, there's a wiki if you're that curious. I'm mainly focusing on the first 5 seasons of My Hero Academia. I'm familiar with some of the future manga stuff, so I'll mention that briefly, but I figure that the first 5 seasons is more than enough time to flesh out the main character. In contrast, I will fight anyone about Fate lore, so I'll be pulling from primarily the visual novel since it's the most detailed. Why be a hero? Seriously, you have to have a damn good reason if you're going to throw yourself in front of fucking Heracles or this thing for someone you barely know. A character's primary motivation is a pretty important thing to establish in order for the audience to be able to understand them. I'm going to talk about Shirou's motivations first to try and highlight the discrepancy between him and Deku. After the fire, Shirou was left an empty husk of a human, with no emotions, desires, or even memories of his own. So when he saw the smile on the face of the man who saved him, he asked himself if he could be that happy were he to save someone. That wish, coupled with his survivor's guilt and the dying lamentations of his father, who failed to be a hero, led Shirou to becoming the single-minded hero of justice we all know and love. Shirou's heroism is thus quite a selfish thing in reality. He saves people because it's quite literally the only thing that brings him joy. This leads to something that anime-only Fate fans might not realise the first time through. Shirou is fundamentally batshit insane. His way of thinking is so absurd that the world literally ranks it on the same level as aliens and demons. This mental distortion resulted in a character that almost compulsively saves people, really more a machine than a person. And then there's Deku, who saw All Might at age 4 and was like, I'ma do that. And as we all know, what you want to be at 4 is an accurate reflection of your desires, so 10 years later, Deku's still on that hero grind set. Look, I don't want this to just be me dunking on Deku constantly, but for something so integral to his character, we're given very little reasoning as to why Deku is so determined to be a hero. There's nothing wrong with having a motivation based on looking up to someone, but most of the time that motivation comes from a more base desire. Wanting to be famous and have adoring fans, wanting to be the best, wanting money, whatever. Even Bakugo has a more understandable motivation. Yeah, he's a dick, but wanting to be the best and never lose is a pretty common motive from people. Deku seems to just want to be a hero because he came out of the womb that way, wanting to save people for the intrinsic beauty and morality of it. Which is all well and good, but if you'd let me bust out that one psych class I took in high school, it's very much on the self-actualization tier of good old Maslow's Triforce. A pretty complex and mature motivation for someone who is only 14 and has very little life experience at this point. Again, I don't hate Deku, and in actuality he at least has better motivations than 90% of generic anime boys that are super heroic for no goddamn reason, but the fact is that most of the other characters in his own show have better written motives for their goal. The lack of an interesting motivation is probably the first factor that makes Deku feel incredibly bland and uninteresting. Not bad, just not great either. Now, when I say how, I'm not talking about the way a hero performs heroism. We'll talk about that in the what section, which, now that I say it out loud, sounds pretty fucking stupid, but we'll roll with it. The how is quite literally their abilities and powers that they use to fight the baddies like every good hero. The powers of both Deku and Shirou are pretty heavily linked to their characters. Deku wants to become the symbol of peace, inheriting the title from his predecessors, and as such his power is quite literally the stockpiled power gathered by each of the previous one-for-all wielders. A pretty heavy-handed metaphor for the passing of the torch, but whatever. Shirou views himself more as a weapon than a human, and is obsessed with becoming a hero that can save everyone. So having his ability be the perfect replication of the weapons of heroes along with their abilities is pretty appropriate. It's also complementary to the whole theme of Fate, you know, the summoning of ancient heroes to do battle thing, and it's probably my favourite example of a main character's power actually relating to and complementing the plot of the story it exists in, as opposed to, you know, being a random ability pulled out of nowhere. To be honest, I personally dislike One For All as an ability. I mean, how many generic I can get really strong and fast abilities do we need in shonen? My hero has some of the most interesting powers in its sidecast, but until season 5, our main character is stuck with the most generic power-up ability in the whole show. My dislike for the ability isn't really a fault of Deku's character, however, so we'll skip over it. In fact, I actually like the way Deku uses his ability in spite of its simplicity, overcoming the limitations using his intelligence. We get so many dumbass main characters in shonen that seem to be cut from the same archetype of dumb and eats a lot but has a heart of gold, that having a main character that's intelligent, somewhat unsure of himself but still a hero in spite of that, is a breath of fresh air. My problem with Deku's character actually comes from before he gets One For All, when he was quirkless. Both our main characters start off pretty crippled. Deku is quirkless and Shirou hasn't unlocked his magic circuits. For the non-Fate nerds among you, that basically means he has no mana pool and was casting spells with his vitality. The way our heroes responded to this challenge couldn't be more different though. Every single night, Shirou goes in his shed and practices his magecraft, performing the equivalent of inserting a hot iron rod down his spine, real quote from the visual novel, in order to cast the simplest of spells. He doesn't even get a decent payoff for this, as after almost 10 years of practicing, he's barely above the level of a normal human, and his primary attack is swinging pipes and rolled up posters. Despite this, every night, he goes back in and he keeps trying, kind of showcasing his mental distortion. When Deku finds out he's quirkless, he doesn't let it discourage him, proudly proclaiming he still wants to be a hero and working towards this by writing journals, I guess? Don't get me wrong, Deku's intellect and quirk analysis serve him well, and his journals were good training, but seriously? No physical conditioning, no self-defense training, no weapons training or support gear designs. Deku, before he has a super powerful quirk handed to him on a silver platter, seems to have put almost no effort into achieving his dream. And before you come at me with the people without quirks can't be heroes so why bother training, I call bullshit on that. Aizawa throws hands with mutant quirks, where he effectively has no quirk himself. Stein's quirk requires that he land a blow for it to do anything, and yet he still manages to keep up with pro heroes along with Todoroki and Deku. Ojiro's quirk is quite literally just a fucking tail. If Deku really trained, he likely could have been a hero without a quirk. Maybe a vigilante if he couldn't get into school. That honestly would have been a more interesting story, a commentary on how your inherent disadvantages don't preclude you from success if you try hard enough. But instead of taking the interesting route, my hero as usual chooses the generic, give the main character the super special ultra ability that solves all his problems route. Honestly, I can understand why Bakugo would be salty. I mean, he may be a dick, and trust me, I would hate him as a person, but you can't deny Bakugo put in work to get where he is. I mean, just look at him. Dude's obviously been training for years to get to that point, and he didn't need a specially created training plan from the top hero to get there. Sure, he has a strong quirk, but his mastery over it and his combat instincts speak to countless hours of training to get where he is, and then Deku just gets the power and mentorship handed to him. I'd be salty too. Shirou is willing to undergo immense torment to achieve his goals, and Deku is too. That's the weird thing. We see that Deku is willing to blow off his limbs in order to help others, so it's just weird that he never seemed to care enough to do so before the story started. It's another instance of the pre-story Deku being largely irrelevant to the story, meaning all we have to go off is the Deku we see on screen, who is unfortunately pretty uninteresting. With that being said, I guess we should move on to what being a hero actually means to both these characters. What is a hero? I know that sounds like the kind of boring rhetorical question you'd find at the start of every video essay, but seriously. In the modern age, what constitutes a hero? Sure, the person that pulls someone out of a burning building is a hero, but so is the paramedic that resuscitates them, and the surgeon that saves their life. A teacher voluntarily helping people without access to education is also a hero, so heroism doesn't necessarily require excessive danger. It just so happens that in anime, heroism and excessive violence tend to go hand in hand. So what is Deku's idea of heroism? Well, he wants to be a symbol of peace, someone who people feel safe just being around and who discourages villains simply by existing. This is honestly a really cool end goal for a main character. I know, I'm actually complimenting Deku, where's my relentless shitting on his character? But I gotta give props where it's due. Becoming a symbol of peace is a concrete end goal with tangible steps that can be taken towards it. It acknowledges the fact that no matter how strong you are, you can't possibly beat everywhere at once. And so, instead of the typical anime strat of beat everyone up until no one is evil anymore, Deku has a very real reason to get stronger and fight villains. He fights the villains in front of him to save who he can, but he knows that the real biggest impact he could have is by becoming an icon that discourages villainy itself. If you were expecting me to criticise Shirou here, well, you've probably not realised how much of an Emiya simp I am. Shirou follows the exact generic hero route I described above, go around looking for conflict, solve it, move on. But in what probably seems like a cop-out response, this actually makes sense for his character. Remember, Shirou's heroism is fundamentally selfish. He needs to save people in order to be happy, and so a world in which there are no villains is a world that he has no reason to live in. Shirou simply enjoys the act of saving, so wandering from battlefield to battlefield is a perfect route of heroics for him, even if it further exposes the hypocrisy and absurd nature of his ideals. Unfortunately for the My Hero fans, while Deku's internal motivations are solid, every internal character motivation needs an external response from the world the character exists in. And sadly, the world of My Hero does very little to make Deku's goal and journey interesting for the first 5 seasons. To examine why, let's look at how Fate uses its plot to directly examine and develop the core ideals of Shirou. Each of the routes in Fate examines a separate part of Shirou's character. In the Fate route, we are introduced to Shirou and his ideals for the first time and understand the character in its base state. In Unlimited Blade Works, Shirou is forced to confront the end result of his self-destructive ideals, a life filled with regret and agony. He's forced to accept the inherent flaws in his ideals, the impossibility of actually saving everyone and the harm that such an ideal will bring to those closest to him. Nevertheless, he concludes that despite its impossibility, the mere act of striving towards his impossible ideal is in itself beautiful, and that the act of saving another cannot be wrong even if it results in the future he is presented with. Finally, in Heaven's Seal, Shirou gets both metaphorically and literally mindfucked by his own ideals. He's presented with an ultimatum: either kill the woman he loves to save the world, or attempt to save Sakura and in the process risk every other life on the planet. If he takes the first option, he truly becomes little more than a machine, weighing lives on a scale and saving the side with the most people. The Mind of Steel ending. If he refuses to kill Sakura, he is betraying the ideal that forms the core of who he is as a person, the only thing that barely makes him human. He turns his back on heroism and it breaks him apart mentally. Well, the swords to the brain probably help there, but you get my point. Each of these routes is an example of the plot and the character being intrinsically linked together. Each route explores and develops another aspect of Shirou's character in this sort of symbiotic relationship. And by the end of the holy fuck, I spent 100 hours reading this? Jesus. So after 100 hours with Shirou, you're left with a full understanding of his character and what heroism means to him on the deepest possible level. In contrast to this, the villains of My Hero Academia feel uninspired and, for lack of a better word, safe. For all of the 5 seasons I've watched, we rarely see Deku's ideal or core character traits truly challenged by his enemies. But in true My Hero fashion, we come so close. Stain is probably the best example. A villain aiming to destroy this heroic society focused more on popularity and celebrity status than actual heroism. What an awesome villain for Deku to fight. One that forces him to confront the possibility that he's contributing to a system that is inherently flawed, and that the heroes he looks up to are merely in it for the money and the fame. That's an interesting moral quandary for our main character, but instead he's portrayed as a madman, attacking the beloved elder brother of our side character so that Deku gets to beat him into the dirt without really having to think too much about it. Hell, Stain does more to develop Ida's character than he does Deku's. The start of the series also has an amazing opportunity to develop Deku's character. All Might, his idol, the one who spawned his ideals and inspired him to be a hero, says he can't become one simply due to the way he was born. This could have been an awesome character building moment for Deku. Does he keep trying to be a hero? Does he no longer idolize All Might? Does he want to prove him wrong or otherwise reevaluate his goals? Not to mention that All Might himself started quirkless, so there's this whole self-doubt development for All Might's character. It's good stuff. But instead of that, we get Deus Ex Hair. Deku gets a neat superpower, and the issue of quirk discrimination is once again pushed off onto another, more interesting side character. Instead of these moments, we get generic, almost cartoonish villains for Deku to fight. Redestro has an interesting moral foundation, questioning the right of society to impose limits on individuals' natural born abilities, and saying these restrictions are the reason so many turn to villainy after being cast out. A pretty interesting stance for a villain, and one that would likely challenge Deku's faith in the hero society he strives to be a part of. Unfortunately, he's also an insane, unlikable asshole that kills on a whim, so that once again Deku's ideals go unchallenged and he's able to fight the bad guys in a good old black and white good versus evil showdown. We still have no real idea about what All For One, the main villain of the whole show, actually wants other than to rule Japan and act like a dick whilst doing so. Chisaki is what? A germaphobe that wants to erase quirks because they're a disease or something? How relatable and interesting. Seriously, the fight between Deku and Overhaul is almost a 10 out of 10 between the animation, choreography and soundtrack. I mean, they play All For One's theme during Deku's final attack, how fucking hype is that? But the constant flashbacks to a backstory that, let's be honest, no one really cares about, drag the fight down. Off the top of my head, a more interesting motive would be for Overhaul to actually be a hero that's trying to counter the quirk singularity theory, trying to stop quirks before they become so powerful they rip the world apart. With that motivation, not only do you build out the world a bit more, but you make the villain actually reasonable, and so you force Deku to make a really tough decision. Is the life and happiness of Eri worth more than the lives of everyone else on the planet who could die if quirks aren't reined in? You may notice the parallels here to Heaven's Feel and how such a decision would force Izuku's character to change and grow. I'm not saying every villain in My Hero is uninteresting, there's a few that I'm pretty hyped to see animated, but the main ones, the ones that mainly interact with Izuku, do very little to grow or explore his character at all. This section has gone on for way longer than I really wanted it to, so let's see if I can't wrap this up succinctly. I want to reiterate that I actually like My Hero. The show could carry itself purely off of its fight scenes, OST, animation and interesting side characters. My main grievance is that Deku himself adds very little to the show as a whole. Every route of fate in some way explores, develops or challenges Shirou and his ideals about heroism. Pretty much every villain or obstacle he encounters serves as another opportunity for the audience to further understand what being a hero means to his character. Each fate route feels like Shirou's story, as opposed to a story with Shirou in it. In My Hero, however, while the story does feature Deku, so far it hasn't really felt like Deku's story. But like I said at the beginning, I didn't make this video just to dunk on Deku, even if that ended up being more of the video than I wanted. As a fan of the series, there have been quite a few scenes in the recent seasons that have developed Deku's character a fair bit, the confrontation with Bakugo and the rescue of Eri being among them. More than those, however, for those that read the manga, you know that the next few seasons have the potential to blow every prior season out of the water. I honestly believe that, if done correctly, the upcoming arcs of My Hero will be some of the most engaging we've seen. Not in spite of Deku, but because of him. The development your boy Izuku is about to get is insane, and hopefully I'll be making another video in the future ridiculing this one for being wrong and praising Izuku as a character. Hopefully. assuming they actually pace it right and don't spend half a season focusing on side characters. Again. This video was honestly more of an experiment than anything, just to kind of see if I could get a bit better at voiceovers and whatnot. I'll be back to my normal meme videos soon, so don't you worry. If anyone actually does end up getting this far, then holy shit, feel free to tell me how horrible it was in the comments and how bad my voice is at doing voiceovers, because I'm sick of it after hearing it for 20 minutes straight. Thanks for watching though. I guess that's how YouTubers end their videos, right?